Okay, so let's get into our training a little bit. So as with when I was a teacher, I created a community in my classroom. I want to create that here in the Friend Academy. So, and in work, um, we also had like operating agreements and some of my professional things. So I've created some learning environment agreements. So when you come to a Friend Academy training, here's what I'd like you to bring with you. Um, a level of respect. So let's be respectful of everybody's journey and their path and where they are, because some people will be brand new to the deaf and hard of hearing journey. Some people will be like me and sort of, you know, old hat. We've been through a lot of things, and some people will be kind of in the middle. So just respectful of where everybody's at and kind of their emotional level. Bring an open mind and heart. So when I say that, I mean, come with a clear mind. You might have some preconceived notions or some ideas about what we might be talking about, but if you come with an open mind, you'll be open to learning something new. And maybe someone else will have a different perspective and broaden our horizons that way. Ask questions. I don't know what you don't know, and so I want you to ask questions. There is no dumb question in my book, so please ask anytime. I want you to share your knowledge, because I live by this little reminder in the back of my head. Every person you meet knows something you don't. So I am not here to say that I know everything there is to know about deaf and hard of hearing. I am constantly learning. I want to learn from your experiences and your knowledge, and then we can share that with others. So please be willing to share what you know and your experiences. I'm going to encourage you to take risks and try something new, maybe expand your thought process, maybe ask a challenging question. So take risks in our learning environment. That's how we all can learn. And most importantly, let's have fun together, because sometimes we're presented with a daunting task as parents and caregivers. So I want you to just have fun and learn together and build this community. So I can see most of you on my screen. So if these are agreements that you think you can adhere to, give me a thumbs up. Awesome, thanks. Okay, so before I get into the meat and potatoes of the training, I also want to create a little framework and acknowledgement. So I spoke to it a little bit in our learning environment agreements, but I want to acknowledge that I don't know where most of you are in your journey. I don't know what background knowledge you have yet. And this was something when Stephanie and I talked about what training do we do first? What do we cover? How do we do it? Knowing that there's a vast array of different stages in this journey. So I'm going to acknowledge that sometimes in our training, this might be information you know, and sometimes it might be brand new, totally something you've never heard before, and there might be something in between. So I'm acknowledging that if you are more experienced in your journey and you have attended maybe a lot of trainings, have a lot of background information, I want you to try to take away one or two nuggets, maybe see where there's something a little different about the way you learned it, or give yourself some affirmation. Hey, I know this. I can kind of sit back and go, yes, I'm one step further in my journey and I already know this information. So take it as an affirmation. So I just want you to know that. And then to create a little framework that we are kind of tonight creating a foundation like we do for our kiddos. Like we have to build a lot of background knowledge and have to come to a common understanding before we can move them forward. So that's kind of what we're going to do tonight. So my intentions for this training is to create this foundation. So we're going to create a shared understanding and framework for learning about hearing loss as a low incidence disability that has a high impact on the individual who is impacted by it. We're going to adopt a viewpoint that hearing loss creates barriers to access. You will probably get sick of hearing that from me because that's sort of my platform. Hearing loss is all about access. So we will be adopting our view of hearing loss as an access disability. And then we're going to identify some key areas of development or key areas of an individual's life that are impacted by having a hearing loss. So I want you to take a minute and either think to yourself, write, or if you have a partner with you, you can chat with your partner. I'm going to say a word and I want you to write down the first things that pop into your head. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to do that. So the word is hearing. Jot down the first things that pop into your head. Okay, I'm going to bring you back. You had a lot of things. I can see people still writing. That's great. So keep those things in mind as we talk about the next slide. So in order to understand hearing loss, we first need to understand hearing. And this is where I want to really create a framework. And I didn't always view it in this way until I met a woman named Carol Flexer, who is pretty famous in our field of deaf and hard of hearing. And she made me have a mind shift when I thought about hearing. So she talks about hearing as an access of auditory information to the brain. So it's the brain's access of auditory information. So I'm going to take you through what hearing really is. So if you look here at my slide, this indicates sound coming in. And sound is going to come in to our ear. And there are three parts to our ear. I'm not going to go into depth and detail about all the parts of the ear, but we have three parts. We have an outer, a middle, and an inner ear. And so in order for hearing to occur, our sound has to come in through the outer ear. So that's collecting that sound. It needs to go through all parts of the ear. It needs to go through the outer, the middle, and the inner. And what happens there is the ear works its magic, if you will, or it transforms, it changes this sound input that we've gotten from our environment or somebody talking. It goes into the ear magically changes it into a signal that the brain can receive and understand. So once it creates that signal, it takes it to the auditory nerve, and the auditory nerve connects that ear to the brain where we actually hear. So that's the key that Carol taught me. We hear in the brain, not our ear. So our brain then needs to take that signal that it can now understand because the ear changed it into the signal that the brain could receive and process. And then through learning, we develop meaning in the brain. So hearing is a sense, just like our eye, our sight, our taste, our touch, our smell. Those are our main senses, and our brain is fed by those senses. So when we think about hearing, it is our brain's access to auditory information. So look at what you wrote down about hearing and see if that aligns with what your concept of hearing was. If it didn't, what new things maybe popped up for you? Or what things make you go, I'm not really sure about that. And you can write yourself a note. You can talk if you have a partner with you. And just give yourself a minute to reflect on that, because it's important to understand where we're coming from with hearing before we talk about hearing loss. Okay. Now I'm going to say the next words to you, and I want you to write down the first things that pop in your head. And I'm going to say hearing loss. What pops into your head? All right. So if we take what I just told you to be true, that we hear with our brain, that's where hearing actually occurs, and that hearing is the brain's access to auditory information, then hearing loss can be simply viewed as what happens is it blocks the brain's access to auditory information. So hearing loss prevents access of auditory information from getting to the brain where we hear. So that can occur in many ways. It can in any part of the ear. So it can occur in the outer ear. Something can obstruct that signal from even entering. It can occur somewhere in the middle ear, like we might have fluid or something, or it can occur in the inner ear where we have sensory neural hearing loss. So you probably know the type of hearing loss that your child has and probably the level of hearing loss. And if there was a specific diagnosis, you might know exactly where that barrier is occurring, or it might be something that you find out later on. Hearing these barriers that prevent the access from getting to the brain where we hear is what creates the barriers for that auditory information getting to the brain. So it can be caused by a number of things, and we could probably have a week's long training on causes of hearing loss, levels of hearing loss, but it doesn't matter if it's a small, mild hearing loss or if it's a big, profound hearing loss, it still is an access barrier. And so from an audiological standpoint, we do things, or a medical standpoint, we do things to try to break down that barrier to allow that sound, again, to have that clear path to the brain where we can hear. So things like hearing aids, cochlear implants, bone anchored hearing aids, hearing assistive technology, all of those things are from the medical technological side of things that help break down those barriers. And then the other piece is when I said the brain then has to make meaning of that sound. So those technology pieces will help get that signal there, but then we have work to do, and that's where we all come into play in helping our child's brain make sense out of that information that's coming in. So it's another way to break down the barrier. So this is just to give you the framework of hearing loss as an access barrier. So we've looked at hearing, and now what prevents it from the brain from getting that auditory information. The next thing I want you to think about is this word, okay? I'm going to say the word. I want you to write down what comes to your mind. And I'm going to say impact. And that could be anything that pops into your head. Just write down what you think about when I say the word impact. Okay, I'm going to bring us from hearing loss into the impact of hearing loss. And so remember when I said the intention, you're going to hear me say access a lot. Hearing loss creates barriers to access that can lead to challenges in key areas. So when we talked about it from an audiological or a medical standpoint, they just look at where is that access barrier occurring and what can we do to facilitate that sound from getting through to the brain from a hearing standpoint. Then we need to look at the overall human being that's being impacted, and then what that brain does and what the auditory information, like how we learn in this world. So hearing loss can create access barriers that can lead to challenges in the following areas. We're just going to touch on these a little bit tonight, and I want you to think about them. And then our next focus trainings are going to go more into depth in each of these 5 key areas that we identified as sort of common biggies in our support of kids with hearing loss. So the first one is communication and language. So if we think about a baby that's typically hearing, they start hearing in utero. And so they're already exposed to learning before they're born. And then they listen to their family and their environment for a year. They kind of play with their speech a little bit and babble, but they don't really have language for that full year. So if we have barriers that prevent all of that exposure to language and communication from coming in, then hearing loss can impact the development of communication and language for our kids. So sometimes our kids are delayed in their language development and their communication due to an access to that information all the time. The other point I want to make about this is unlike our other senses, our ears don't have a way to close off. Like if I don't want to be exposed, if I don't want to expose my brain to something that's visual, I can close my eyes and it's gone. I can plug my nose and the smell is gone. I cannot put a food in my mouth and I can't taste it. Touch, we cannot touch something purposely and not expose our brain to that. Our ears, we don't have that ability. So we are hearing all the time. So we're exposed to auditory information even when we're sleeping. So communication and language and hearing loss, this is why it has a big impact, because it is a sense that our brain needs, and we have to fill it in another way for kids with hearing loss. So once we develop our communication and language, then we're able to learn. So when I say learning, it could be from early childhood, it could be our academic environment, it could be learning something in the community, but we use language in order to learn. So if we've had some access issues or challenges in developing our communication and language, then that may lead into some challenges with learning because we don't have that foundation. We don't have all that we need to access the learning. And then environment, we may have an access barrier due to a hearing loss because of even if we have the best hearing technology, it doesn't always guarantee that we have a clear signal, or there's background noise involved, or the walls and or the flooring isn't good for reverberation, or maybe at school we might have a challenge there. So environment can be an access barrier due to hearing loss. And then I'm going to bring it down to incidental learning, which I'm going to define as overhearing or overseeing, overlearning. So these are the things that kids learn that we don't teach them directly. So often you will hear a parent go, "How did they learn that?" I didn't even teach them that. Like, when did you learn that? I didn't know you knew that, and we learn a lot incidentally. I have an example as an adult. When I had my consulting job, I was placed in an office where I had a cubicle environment, and I was with people who were not on our team. And so the man on the other side of the cubicle was a nursing home inspector for our Department of Health Services. I was not listening to his conversations, but somehow I know a lot about the laws about nursing homes just because of listening to him talk about how many bed units you can have, the safety of that. So incidental learning occurs all the time, even when we're not purposely thinking about it. And so for our kiddos with hearing loss, incidental learning, hearing loss prevents us from having full access to incidental learning. All of that compounds our very basic social emotional development. And there are some more recent studies about infant mental health, and there's a lot of talk about mental health and socialization and social emotional development. And we have this big thing called theory of mind that helps us take on other people's perspective. And hearing loss creates barriers to social emotional. It can create, through that communication and that lack of incidental learning, we don't always pick up on all of those things. So as you can see, I can't separate each of these areas apart because all of this makes up a whole person and a whole learning environment, or a whole way that we learn to interact with the world around us. So when we talk about a big impact, hearing loss can impact all of these areas, even if it's a unilateral loss or a mild hearing loss. It can impact areas that we don't even think about. So I always like to say it's more than, I just can't hear very well. It impacts a lot of areas. Okay. So now I want you to think about that impact and listen to this word and tell me what you think about this. Write it down. Low incidence. What does that mean to you? All right. So low incidence simply means it doesn't happen very often. In our field of education or in the adult world of deaf and hard of hearing, so hearing loss is considered a low incidence disability. Like vision loss, hearing loss, both are low incidence disabilities. So in our special education world, by definition, it's considered low incidence when the rate is less than 1% of statewide enrollment in special education. So basically, that means that your child may be the only child that that district has seen who has a hearing loss for a long time, or there may be one child and 10 years later another child, or unless you're in a more populated area, you could be the only family experiencing that in your area. They make up about 20% of all students who receive special education, so that's not a high number. So in addition to the barrier that the hearing loss itself causes, sometimes we face this also, we're in the category of low incidence. And so I don't know if you've heard it from your school districts or at all, like, well, you're a low incidence population. And that's sometimes not a very nice term to hear, because then you're like, well, what does that mean for me? Does that mean I'm not as important? Absolutely not. It doesn't mean that at all. It actually, in my mind, says, hey, you need to up your ante to make sure that my child receives the same level of education that everybody else. So we're going to move on to talk about the impact that low incidence might have. So it being part of a low incidence disability might create additional access barriers. So like I just gave you the example, you may be the only child in your area, or they might not have seen a deaf or hard of hearing child for the last 10 years. Sometimes you may have trouble getting access to professionals who are specifically trained in deaf and hard of hearing, or programming that's created specifically for deaf and hard of hearing. Or the curriculum might not be accessible, or they might not have specific deaf and hard of hearing curriculum, and peers, other kids who might be experiencing hearing loss. So it's kind of a double access barrier. So the hearing loss by diagnosis itself has impact on the person's development and learning. And also the fact that it's a low incidence disability presents us in the education world with another barrier to access and some additional challenges. So we wouldn't be doing our due diligence in this day and age with our pandemic if we did not talk a little bit about COVID and what that impact has on our kids with hearing loss. So when we talked about the development, so let me go back a couple slides. There you go. So when we talk about the hearing loss itself as an access barrier, and now we have a different era where every school district is sort of doing something different. And some parents we know are choosing to homeschool. Some kids are doing virtual school. Some kids are attending in person. Some are hybrid. So all of these areas that we talked about that are access to barriers are now compounded a little bit by mask wearing, by if they are distance and they need an interpreter, how do they access that interpreter? Captioning, can they get their captioning in their classrooms? So all of the things that are in their IEP or 504, if they have one, are now going to look a little bit different. So Stephanie and I were actually talking today that we need to help you problem solve that through our Friend Academy. And so thinking about hearing loss as access barrier to these areas of development, and then how is that going to look for your child in whatever learning environment that they're in, and what then can we do to break down those barriers. And then, so that's the hearing loss impact. And then if we go to the impact of the low incidence, when they're planning to educate kids in this pandemic in various ways and means, how much has the school district thought about all of the kids and our low incidence kids especially? So we have come across some resources that we will share with you that kind of help. In fact, today I saw a study that they did about which masks actually are best for our kids and which one, you know, they've done some sound studies to see if they have access with their assistive listening devices and a mask, or which masks are best to use. There are some ways to help with distance learning, like even if your child is doing auditory training, if they need access to a sign language interpreter, how do we do that via distance? And we'll probably tap into Stephanie's professional side of things a little bit, because she's having some firsthand experience as a teacher, DHH teacher right now, trying to program and advocate for her kids getting access to their environment and education. So we hear you and will definitely help you along that way. So this is, for me, was hard because this is the the heavy part of it, like pointing out, that's the what. Like, this is the reality of hearing loss. This is the impact that hearing loss really has. But we as parents and educators need to take it seriously. So I wanted to lay that out to you, that that's the what. But then I want to offer you a now what, because this is the part that I really love doing. So the now what, now that we know what we're dealing with and we're changing our view and we're viewing it as an access issue, now we can figure out what to do to break down those barriers. How do we provide that access? So in our future trainings and our coaching calls, we're going to increase your awareness of what are these access barriers specifically. So we'll take each of those parts and we will break it down smaller. We're going to help you expand your knowledge of strategies that break those barriers down. So you're going to have tools to use to help your child. Then you not only learn those tools, but you'll be able to apply them to your individual situation, and so that you can increase the access for your child. And then we're going to not totally just focus on the impact or the hearing loss. We want you to also be able to view your child as a whole person. So what are those strengths and interests and things that your child does really well? We're going to take those and help you apply the strategies so you can embrace your child and your family as an individual, view them as a whole person who happen to have hearing loss. And hearing loss is a part of who they are. It doesn't completely define who they are. I want you to be able to gain confidence as you create your family's path. I'm not here to tell you that you need to take my path, and because my path was the only path. There are many paths that will get you through your deaf and hard of hearing journey, but I'm here to just help you create your path that works for you, where you are and where you want your child to be. I want you to be a part of this community. It was great to see all of you come tonight. It's nice to have your faces, and community is important when we sort of have our own, we feel like we're on our own journey, maybe our own island. Sometimes because of that low incidence population, we don't always meet other people who know what it's like to be us. And then we want you to make decisions based on the needs of your child, your family, and that have some proven results. So that's kind of what we're hoping to accomplish in our trainings. And then between now and 2 weeks, when our community members have a coaching call with me, I want you to think about hearing loss as an access barrier. And I want you to think about your family and your situation and see where you see barriers that might be caused by the hearing loss. I want you to write down the questions that popped up tonight for you, or as you reflect. I'm a thinker, so when I attend a training, I can't always think of my questions right off the top of my head, but I just take it all in and then I think about it, and then it's like, oh, I wish I would have asked that. So we're hoping that through our coaching calls, if you're like me and think about things and then have questions later or want to share an epiphany, that we'll be able to do that through our group coaching calls. And specifically, in our next coaching call, we're going to talk about observation. So how can you observe so you can identify those access barriers that you and your child might be experiencing due to hearing loss? So that's about what I have for you tonight. I don't know if, why don't we hold questions, Stephanie, until I'm going to turn it over to you. And then if we have some time and people have questions, we can answer them then. Does that sound like an okay plan?
Yes, that sounds fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Bev.
Yep, I'm going to stop sharing and let you
Yep.
take over.